And hello, it's a Wednesday. Welcome to our Wednesday Live, where we talk about Hebrew roots of our Christian faith. And I am super excited. And I had a kind of a busy day today with clients earlier, so I'm on later than usual. So, but I really wanted to get this out there because today at sundown, we're ushering in the holiday of Purim. And it's so awesome. And I really have so much to share with you guys. So we're ushering this in as the sun goes down today, and it's celebrated every year on the 14th of this month of Adar that we are in. So today is the 13th, and today is a very important day, and we're going to talk about all of those. So the celebration begins tonight, and that is the celebration of the victory that happened today. So today marks the day of the year when Esther, in the story of Esther, when there's a great victory. And so that is really cool. It commemorates this incredibly divinely orchestrated in the salvation of the Jewish people, right? At the hands of Haman. And there was this huge plot to destroy and annihilate the Jews, right? The young and old, the infants and the women in one single day. That was what was supposed to happen on Adar 13. Purim actually means lots, as in drawing a lot. And that's what happened. Haman had drawn a lot to determine when he would carry out this incredible scheme to take out the Jews. So this is the day that the Jews were saved from execution. And tomorrow is the celebration of the miracle of Purim. And it's really a joyous occasion. It's celebration, and prayers of thanksgiving are held to celebrate what they call the days of darkness being transformed into light, joy, and happiness. So we're going to dig into that a little bit and talk about what this spirit of liveliness and fun is about Purim. It's the happiest holy day on the Jewish calendar. It is because look at what it signifies. It signifies so much victory. And the Bible teaches us, so we know that Israel fought many wars and they lost millions of people over the years. And the Bible tells us that in this particular story of Esther, what was supposed to be their demise, not one Hebrew was lost. Not one was lost. So this is very interesting. The book of Esther is one of the most well-known. In fact, outside of the 5 books of the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Esther is the best known book to non-Jews. So outside of the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then Esther is the next most well-known book. And so every year at Purim, it is studied. And the story of Esther is studied, and the scroll of Esther, in a sense, you think about each book on a scroll, and it's read and studied because it's there to remind us not only to glorify God, but to teach our children. Back in the days when before the Bible was made, every story was passed down. They were written on scrolls, but they were passed down from generation to generation. Remember, in Deuteronomy, it says, never forget, always teach our children everywhere we go, when we're laying down, when we're walking along, teaching our children who God is. And so this story is to be passed down from generation to generation. And what we want to do is equip our children to have even a deeper and better relationship with God than we do, to equip them with things so that they can search and discover and find these things out. We want to pass on this understanding so that they can build on that and even go deeper with it. We want it to be passed on from generation to generation, right? So let's look at the story of Esther, and we're going to see some history you might not be aware of, some practicals for us today. There was some things that I discovered in researching for this, I've read the book of Esther, and I've even taught on Purim before, Purim last year, and we've been studying this out for the last 4 years. And just like God does with his Bible and with his word, every time you come into something that's familiar, you're going to learn more. You're going to learn more. It's an amazing thing. So we're going to talk about some things. So the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC extended over 127 lands, and the Jews were its subjects. Okay. So when King Ahasuerus and his wife, Queen Vashti, she was executed for failing to follow his orders. He had his wife executed, Queen Vashti. And we know in the story of Esther that he arranged a beauty pageant to find a new queen. So he was on the hunt for the most beautiful girl in the land, and that would be Esther. Esther would be the one that would find favor in his eyes, and she became the new queen. But she was hiding something. She was a Jew. And so she was hiding her nationality, and he had no idea. So meanwhile, there was a man named Haman, and he was made prime minister of the empire. So he had a very high position, and he had a hatred for the Jews that we will see goes back for generations. He had a hatred. So Mordecai was the leader of the Jews. So imagine this huge empire, and the Jews had their own leader, and that was Mordecai, and he happened to be Esther's cousin. So he defied the king's orders when Haman asked, he wanted people to bow down to him, and he was incensed when Mordecai refused to do that. So he convinced the king to issue a decree basically ordering the extermination of all the Jews. And he put out a lottery and drew the lot that said it would happen on the 13th day of Adar. That's why it is called Purim. So that date was chosen. And so what did Mordecai do? Mordecai went into action, and he got all the Jews to repent and fast and pray to God for them to be saved from this, right? So meanwhile, he goes to Esther, who is in the king's palace, right? And he says to her, you have to do something. You have to go to your husband and tell him who you are and ask him to change this edict that had come down. So it was a huge deal for her to ask to see the king, not invited, and so she put her life on the line, and she asked the king and Haman to join her for a feast. And it was at that feast that she revealed her own Jewish identity. So the king, who loved Esther, he turned the tables on Haman that day, today, the 13th of Adar, and Haman was executed on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And to top it off, Mordecai was appointed prime minister in his place. So a new decree was issued granting the Jews the right to defend themselves against their enemies. So think about all that happened here. All that happened, they call it the boomerang, when God boomeranged everything back on Haman. Think about what happened. Not only were the Jews spared, but they were given rights to defend themselves against their enemies. So they mobilized and killed many of their enemies. And on the 14th day, which would be tomorrow, they rested and celebrated. So one of the things that is associated with this time is a time of fasting. And it's a time that fasting is associated with some of the pivotal moments in the Purim narrative. And one such moment is that they were fasting when Esther approached the king. She was fasting for him to see favor in her, because she was going to do that and intercede on the behalf of her people. And she fasted for 3 days, actually, to prepare for that. And they asked all the Jews to fast with them, with her and Mordecai, and they did. So fasting and praying really was what spoke to God, who then, changed the heart of the king. So another dramatic turnaround occurred on Adar 13, the date that Haman had set aside for killing the Jews. And instead, it was all turned around. And all of this happened as the Jews were fasting. And they prayed for God that they would be successful in this. So this was a miracle. It was miraculous that the Jews were spared, that Esther was able to speak to her husband, and the Jews were this was the miracle of the Jewish survival. And so despite the efforts of our enemies, Purim celebrates God's, I love this, his intimate involvement in every aspect of this world. God was actively pulling strings to care for his nation, for his people. And I think how amazing is that for the situation that we're in today, the times that we are in today. What a powerful thing. So this edict also, what happened in the day of Esther is Haman's edict created a spiritual revival among the Jewish people. And in a sense, this is what is talked about in Hebrew history, is that this was even more significant than the covenant at Sinai, which was this overwhelming spiritual experience that compelled the Jews to accept the Torah, right? When Moses came down and brought down the 10 Commandments. And this occurred of their own volition. That's what made this so much more powerful. It occurred on their own volition, even as they were scattered among the Persian people and immersed in that Persian culture. It was this reawakening of the Hebrew spirit immersed in that. So think about that. God gave the 10 Commandments at a time when he was showing them who he was. But this time the Jews were fighting on their own volition. And it created a spiritual revival. Amazing to think about that. And most of the one of the most amazing parts, and why Esther is so lifted up and why we value this so much, was because of her obedience. And even in light of risking her own life, she obeyed. And so a very famous scripture from this time is when her uncle Mordecai told her, as he was telling her, you've got to do this, and she was wrestling with this, he said to her, the most famous, and if you know the story, you know what this is. And he said, what if you were put here for such a time as this? So what comes to my mind in the Bible is when in Samuel, he's teaching Saul a very important lesson, that obedience is better than sacrifice. It's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? That when God is calling us to do something, that we must obey it, right? Obedience first, obedience last, and obedience always is the lesson. And it's a powerful lesson. Sacrifice without an obedient disposition is off in God's economy. So one is obeying what God is saying is the most important. When we give, obviously we want it to be that sacrifice. Those things are important, but if we're not obeying, that's what isn't the most important, right? So if God is telling you to do something, no matter how small, think of it as major league. God is calling you out, and sometimes it's baby steps. All the things that were in Esther's life prepared her to be able to take a stand like that. So this is a very, very interesting. There's more. There's more. And this is what I discovered in this that I had not known before. So let's go back for an interesting history lesson. In Esther 25, it says Mordecai was the son of Yair, who was the son of Shimi, who was the son of Kish from the tribe of Ben Yamini. And if you're like me, you start to read all those sons of, and kind of go, okay, what does that mean? But it's so important. It's establishing, right, that Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin. And he goes back and he's talking about his ancestors and his line. And this is very important. We'll find in 1 Samuel 9 In verses 1 through 2, we learn that the Hebrew man Kish from the tribe of Benjamin, had a son named Shaul, which would be Saul. Okay, so this is so crazy. So Mordecai is from the line of Saul. So this is from the tribe of Benjamin, right? We know that Saul is the one that was appointed, right? The very first the leader of the Israelites. And he was given a very deliberate instruction from God to go in and kill all of the Amalekites. In Deuteronomy 25, we get the first idea of who the Amalekites were. And God is saying that Adonai is saying that the Israelites would be going along the road and the Amalekites would attack them. And they would attack like Satan does, the stragglers, the ones that were behind, that were in the back. And who would those be? Those would be the children. They would be the ill. They would be the disabled. They would be the ones that were exhausted, and they would just pick them off. They would attack them, just like Satan does. When you think about that, when you think about the lion attacking, like the sheep, they go for the ones that are alone and the ones that are maybe wounded, right? So think about this. He says that they did not fear God. The Amalekites certainly did not fear God. And so God said to blot out all memory of the Amalekites from under heaven. And he was saying, in the land that I'm about to give you to possess, he tells them, do not forget this. So the Amalekites were in the land of Canaan, and they were awful. They were doing awful things, sacrificing infants and children to their gods. They were giving them to prostitution. It was so dark what they were doing. And the Lord declared a perpetual war upon them because they ambushed the weakest of the Hebrews and for how they were living, what they were doing to their own children. And the children that would survive would go on and pass this down from generation to generation, right? So they were told, Samuel told Saul that Adonai said, as the first king over Israel, you must destroy everything. That means take out every man, woman, and child of the Amalekites. And this is hard. I mean, when I first read this, it's sort of like, and I've even heard people say, well, I believe in the God of the New Testament, but not the God of the Old Testament, because it's hard to understand this. But we can't possibly know all that God knows. And when we don't have a Hebrew perspective of what is happening here, we as when we're learning this, we don't know about what the Amalekites did and the gods that they served and what was required of them. But God knows. And so he had a reason why. He was very clear on Saul having to kill them all. So Saul goes in and he decides to allow the king Agag to live. And he takes the very best of the sheep and the cattle, because he's looking at them going, why would the very best of these be killed? So he takes the matters into his own hands. And if you've read the first and second Samuel, you know what happens here. Saul, in his victory, goes back to Samuel and he says, I have done everything that God has called me to do. I have done everything that Adonai has ordered. And he's rejoicing. But Samuel says to him, why do I hear bleating? Why do I hear sheep and cows mooing? What have you done? And Saul, he stands up and he's like, well, the people thought we should keep these for a sacrifice to Adonai. Still not taking responsibility. He decided to take matters into his own hands. And Samuel just tells him, just stop. Don't even. And he says, you have been chosen head over all of the people of Israel. What you do matters. And you took this direction and you did it your own way. So he felt that his thoughts were higher than God's and that he knew better. And Samuel told him, in Adonai's eyes, this is an evil thing that you have done. God's perspective is so much bigger than ours, and we have no idea of the consequences when we do it our own way. So here's an unbelievable tidbit to take this a little bit deeper. So King Agag, who was spared by Saul, would go on to have children, and that line of the Amalekites would persevere and it would go on. And guess what would happen as he would go on? A few generations later, a man named Haman would be born. So Haman is a descendant of the king of the Amalekites that generation from generation would be passed down this hatred of the Jews. And so Samuel would tell Saul that his disobedience, that because of his disobedience, no matter what he sacrificed, it was not good enough because the heart was not to obey. So sacrifice without that obedient disposition would never not only glorify God, but when God is telling him to do something, we see what happened as a result. There's this we know that the Jews they've been trying to take out the Jews, God's people, God's chosen, all throughout, right? So it would go on, and Haman would be born out of that line. How crazy is that? So now here we are generations later, and in the book of Esther, these two men from those lines of their ancestors would meet again, and God would intervene. And that's just so incredible because of Esther's obedience. So she would save her people. What a powerful thing. And we get to celebrate that and align with that. And it's really kind of cool to think about this. Jewish communities have narrowly escaped catastrophe many times, and this keeps going on and on. And we know that there. So here's another plot that happens around the story of Purim. In modern times, in the early 50s, Joseph Stalin, he had major plans for the Jewish problem in the USSR. And just as things were reaching a crisis point in 1953, if you look it up, he died on Purim, on Adar 14. He would die, Stalin. And then in 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq was invading Kuwait. And as pressure ramped up from the international community, his army began firing Scud missiles into Israel. And the rabbi that was over Israel at the time kept assuring the people that they would be protected. And what is so powerful about this is that war ended, the hostilities ended on Purim in 1990, on Adar 14. And so here we are today, facing this war, facing this unrest. And we don't know if things can line up that way if for the year 2022 and the year 5782 on the Hebrew calendar. But we are facing this war and we don't know. We are praying because guess what? God's people, we as Christians, as we are aligned with Abraham and with his promise and his covenant, we are part of that. We are God's people. And so we are praying and we are fasting for God to intervene and for this war to end. And my prayer is that we will see a victory in this. There are many things that are happening out there. And we are so excited to see what is God doing in all of this. And so I encourage you to research this, study out the book of Esther as we celebrate Purim tomorrow. It starts at sundown tonight. So there's a lot of ways I can post some things that they do to celebrate Purim in Hebrew. I'm just now seeing some of your comments. Thank you so much. Yes, but across the country, across here, this is a joyous celebration of God's victory and how he is so involved in our life. And we can't know what he can see. And sometimes we're called to obey things we don't understand, and they might even seem small. But when you step out in faith and obey what he is calling you to do, what is your next step that he is calling you to do? And what a powerful, powerful example we have in Esther, and what an incredible victory we have in celebrating the victory that happened for the Jews there. So exciting. And so I am really excited to, as we're preparing for the spring season coming up. If you have been with us, we are excited to once again count the Omer, which will be happening next month, about I think almost to the day next month. It starts the day after Passover, which will be on the 16th. So it is a month from today. We'll be starting counting the Omer. And that's so exciting. So we'll get much more information about that. But celebrate the victory today. Align ourselves with the incredible victory that we have in the covenant with Abraham of God and his people, knowing that we can rely on him, we can depend on him. We want to pray for everybody that is in Ukraine, that is underneath getting in under that war that is happening right now. That is so that there's so many people being killed and being hurt, and our prayers definitely go out to them in any way that we can support that. So thank you so much for this time. It has been awesome studying this out and seeing those connections of that, and seeing how God knows, and his perspective is bigger than ours. So we just want to align and continue to celebrate that God is bigger and we want to obey. So we love you so much. Sending you blessings of shalom on this Wednesday and this very special day on God's calendar. See you next week. Okay.